So what's KeyForge? KeyForge is a two-player card game in which you attempt to forge 3 keys before your opponent. In order to forge a key, you need to collect amber, 6 per key. How do you collect amber? Using the cards in your deck, you can collect, capture, and steal amber in a variety of ways. Each deck in KeyForge is procedurally generated, and deck building is disallowed. This places the emphasis on players understanding their decks and using the inherent synergies found within. So what are you going to find in each deck? Well, each deck is made up of 36 cards. Each card has a house that it belongs to, and every deck is made up of 12 cards from 3 different houses. You'll also find a handy deck list card with a QR code to register that particular deck to an online account and database, but that's another topic completely. Here are the different houses that could make up any particular deck. Brobnar, the barbarian house that loves a good fight. Mars, a very synergistic house that looks to get an overwhelming board presence. Sanctum, half angels, half knights in shining armor. They very much dislike the next house, which is Dis, the demons of Crucible. They are extremely powerful and very rude. Logos, they are like robot cyborgs that love to draw cards and cycle through decks. Shadows are sneaky guys that love to steal and control the board in interesting ways, and Untamed are all beasts of all shapes and sizes that can get big really fast. So when you open a deck, you'll find 3 of these houses grouped together, each with 12 cards from that particular house. Of those 12, you may get some duplicate cards. For example, you might end up with a deck with 3 Seeker Needles. Generally, redundancy is good, especially if you have a deck with 3 Seeker Needles. If you look at the deck list card, you'll also get these little symbols next to each card title. Those symbols delineate rarity. A circle equals a common card, a diamond equals an uncommon card, a star is a rare card, and a star with a circle in it represents a special card that may behave a bit differently than the standard card distribution. So let's get into gameplay. Before the game begins, randomly determine who will go first. You can do this in many ways, flipping a coin, rolling a die, though apparently this game hates dice, bare knuckle brawling until someone falls over, whatever you want. After you've decided who goes first, both players shuffle their decks and the first player draws 7 cards while the second player draws 6. The first player may then choose to mulligan their hand if they don't like it, and they do so by putting all of the cards back and redrawing, this time stopping with 6 cards. The second player may do the same if they wish, redrawing to 5. The first player then begins, and the turn order goes like this. Phase 1, forge a key. The active player checks to see if they have enough amber to forge a key. If they do, then they must forge one immediately. Remember that the starting amount of amber needed to forge a key is 6, and you're looking to forge 3 keys. There are some cards that raise or lower that 6 cap, so be aware of the game state during this step. You may only forge 1 key during this step, even if you have enough amber to forge multiple. Phase 2, choose a house. The active player then chooses one of 3 houses that make up their deck. Once a house is chosen, the house becomes the active house. The active player may only play, discard, or use cards from that active house during the turn. This means that you may have to make a tough choice between using the cards of one house on the board or playing powerful cards from another house in your hand. After choosing a house, the active player can then choose to take all of the cards from their archive and put them into their hand. The archive is an area where cards sometimes go if an effect says to place a card in the archive. It's not like a draw pile or a discard pile, so don't stress over it too much if you're just starting out. Things only go there if a card tells them to. Phase 3, the main phase. This is where you play cards from your hand, discard cards from your hand, or use creatures or artifacts that are on the board. You can do any of those things in any order that you wish, but again, they must be from the active house. You can't discard cards from your hand, attack with creatures on the board, or use artifacts if they are not part of the active house. Whenever you play a card onto the board, it enters the board state exhausted, meaning it cannot be used until it has been readied. Really quick rundown on playing cards. There's no inherent cost to play cards, so as long as you can meet the house requirements, then you can play any amount of cards that you want. Some cards give you amber when you play them. You'll see this at the top left of a card. Some cards have a keyworded play ability. Those trigger after any amber has been gained from the card and directly after the card has entered play. Let's move on. So after you've finished playing all the cards that you want and doing things with your creatures and all of this other stuff, then you move on to phase 4, the ready phase. In this phase, you ready all of your cards, turning them from horizontal to vertical, taking them from exhausted to ready. And that leads us to the final phase. This is phase 5, the draw phase. So it's interesting because the draw mechanic usually happens at the beginning of a turn. In KeyForge, it happens at the end. So once you've readied everything, you then draw cards from the top of your deck until you have 6 cards in hand. If for some reason you have 6 cards in hand already, then you do not draw. If you have more than 6 cards in your hand at this point, you just keep them. There's no discarding down to 6 in KeyForge. If at any point you run out of cards in your deck, then you actually just shuffle your discard pile and you use it as your deck to continue playing. This is a pretty unique mechanic, as running out of cards in your deck usually means losing in most card games. After you finish your draw phase, play passes to the opponent and they begin their turn, moving in the same order through the phases as I just mentioned. Check to forge a key, declare a house, main phase where you play stuff. Just ready everything after you're done with that, and then draw up to 6, and then you pass. Let's look at the different types of cards in a deck. First up, we have action cards. Action cards are very simple. You play them, they do stuff, then they get discarded. In instances where you can't do everything printed on the card, you do as much of the card text as you can and stop doing things when you no longer have the ability. For example, if a card tells you to shuffle 2 creatures into the owner's deck and there's only 1, then shuffle 1. Next, we have artifacts. Artifacts are played down below your line of creatures, which we'll talk about in a moment, and they stay there unless removed by something. They come into the field exhausted, meaning you can't use the ability on the card until you ready it. Once you do though, you can exhaust this card and use the ability printed on it. When it comes to artifacts, there are 2 different types of abilities that enable a player to use an artifact. There's action abilities and omni abilities. If you have an artifact with an action ability, you can only use that action ability if that is a card that belongs to the active house. Whereas a player can resolve an omni ability even if it is on a card that does not belong to the active house. And do note that artifacts can only do the action or omni ability printed on their card, and they cannot do what characters can do here in a moment when we talk about them. Also, if an artifact says to sacrifice it as part of the effect, then that just means put it in the discard pile. Now we get to creatures. You play creatures in a line in front of your deck, discard pile, artifacts, in front of all of that. The number in the red diamond thing tells you how much power the creature has. Power represents both health and attack, so a 4 power creature will defeat a 3 power creature if they fight. Damage that creature takes doesn't go away at the end of the turn, so that 4 power creature will have 3 little pips on it, 3 damage counters, to show that it took a hit. The number in the little shield on the right is the creature's armor number. If they have an armor number, then that number will soak up that amount of damage per turn. Super important thing about playing creatures. The position that you put them in on the board 100% matters. When a creature comes into play, it has to be put on a flank, meaning on the end of the line that you've created. You can choose to put it on the left or the right, but it must come in on a side and not in between other creatures. If something in the middle dies, it goes to the discard pile, and every other creature on the line of battle slides into the middle. The last kind of card in the game is the upgrade card. These cards are placed under the creature that they're attached to and give the card some special property or buff. If that creature dies, both the creature and the upgrade take a hike to the discard pile. Do note that you cannot play an upgrade card if there isn't something to upgrade on the board. I mentioned fighting with creatures earlier, so let's talk about what you can actually do with creatures, because that is one of the big cruxes of the game. When you plan to use a creature, that player that's using it must exhaust the creature, meaning you slide it horizontally, and at that point you have the option to reap, fight, or trigger the creature's action ability. Reaping is the one that makes the least sense because it's not found in other card games, so let's talk about reaping. Any creature of the active house can reap. When a creature is used to reap, its controller gains an amber. That amber is put into a little pool that's held off to the side so everyone can see it. Then any reap ability that creature has is resolved. Now let's talk about fighting. When a creature is used to fight, the controller chooses one eligible creature controlled by the opponent as the target of the attack, and they just deal each other damage. That damage is of course equal to the power level of each creature, and all damage is dealt simultaneously. Once that's all done with, you'll then put little damage tokens on each creature if they both survive, and if they die, they go to the top of the discard pile. Don't forget to check to see if a creature has an armor value, and if they do, then that armor prevents that much incoming damage each turn. If after the fight your creature that you attacked with survives, and it has a fight ability printed on it, that would be when you'd use that fight ability, only if it survives. And no, you can't use a creature to fight just to trigger a fight ability if there are no eligible enemy creatures to fight. Finally, we have using the creature's action ability, and this one's pretty straightforward. You just exhaust the creature, turning it sideways, and then use the action ability that's on the card. All right, a final few things. First off, this card card game does not like infinite combos. A player cannot play and or use the same card and or other copies of that card more than 6 times, says the rule book. So 6 times is the cap on any infinite combo you can come up with, or that your deck comes up with, I should say. There are a few cards that have constant abilities, and constant abilities do not have a keyword, and they just do things always as long as that creature's out on the field. If you're taking advantage of a constant ability, you're not exhausting the card that has that ability, it just inherently gives it to your stuff. And now we come to chains. Talking about chains means we're talking about both an in-game effect that you can gain during the match, or something you might start the game with because of how powerful your deck might be compared to your opponent's. Chains are arranged like this, and I'm just going to straight up show the rule book on this one. This is what a chain card looks like, and this is kind of pointing out the chain categories. If either before you start playing or during the course of the game you gain these chains, then it essentially puts a cap on how many cards you draw at the end of the turn. So if you have 1 to 6 chains on top of your deck, then you only draw up to 5 rather than up to 6. If you have 7 through 12 chains on top of your deck, then you draw 2 fewer cards, so up to 4. 13 to 18 you draw 3 fewer cards, and 19 to 24, if somehow you have it that insane of a deck or you've just chained yourself to oblivion, you draw 4 fewer cards, so you're only really getting 1 card in your hand or 2 cards in your hand, something like that, each turn. Now those chains are not permanent. Each turn that you would go through the draw phase, you lose one of those chains by drawing fewer cards. So if you had like 3 chains at the end of your draw step, you would draw 1 fewer card and then lose a chain, so you'd be down to 2 chains. Basically sort of like a turn counter telling you how long you have until you're back to normal on the draw step. The goal of chains is basically to assign your deck a handicap. So if your deck is super good because you can't deck build, and your opponent's deck is super terrible because they can't deck build because deck building is illegal, then chains should help balance the scales. So there you go, that's KeyForge in a nutshell. Wow, I went through that in under 12 minutes, so hooray us, I didn't hold you for too long. Now I'm sure I glanced over a lot of things that we could go way more in depth on, so feel free to leave a comment down below if you have questions. I am by no means an expert, but if I don't know something, then I will find somebody who does, and I will do the research necessary to get you an answer at some point. If you found this video fun, informative in any way, shape, or form, please let me know in a comment below and I'll keep making stuff like it. I'm super into KeyForge at the moment. I think it's really cool. It just came out on Thursday. So if you like the game too, let me know. This is not necessarily something I normally make content on. If you're looking at my channel for the first time, I usually make Dice Masters content, which is a great game and you should check it out. But seeing as I'm pretty hyped about KeyForge right now, I may make a few more KeyForge videos in the near future, just because it's a fun game and I want people to experience all types of games. As always, thanks for watching.